Hello and welcome to Latitude at Frontline. This is a new weekly show on Frontline that will focus on India's foreign policy and all the interesting developments across the world that have an impact on our lives. I'm Nirupama Subramanian, and today we'll be talking about the shock that President Donald Trump of the United States delivered with his announcement on April 2nd of massive spikes in tariffs on almost all countries that trade with the United States. He called it Liberation Day. Since then, he has also announced a 90-day pause on the tariffs because of the upheaval in the US bond market due to a panic sell-off of US Treasury bonds that were until recently considered a safe asset. It's given the world some respite and time to think through next steps. With me today to discuss the world according to President Trump is Ashley J. Tellis, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's also the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs. He specializes in international security and US foreign policy and defense policy. His special focus is on Asia and the Indian subcontinent. As a diplomat in the US State Department, he was intimately involved in negotiating the civil nuclear agreement with India. Mr. Tellis, it's good to have you in the inaugural episode of Latitude. Welcome.
Thank you, Nirupama. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start by asking you about the 90-day pause that the Trump administration has announced on these tariffs. Does it mean that sanity is prevailing in the Trump administration, that there is a realization at the highest levels that these tariffs were economically unsound and baseless in their reasoning and in their calculations? Are we seeing the first signs of a plan to roll back these tariffs after 90 days or shelve them and turn this into a narrow trade conflict between US and China, which is what it started out as, isn't it?
So I think it's hard to answer that question with, any confidence, because the aims of President Trump's tariff war are still unclear. Over the course of the several weeks before he enunciated his tariff plan, the reasons that were offered were really multiple. And some of those reasons actually undermine other reasons. So it's hard to sort of divine what the strategic objective really was. And that goes directly to the question you asked, which is, what does all this mean 90 days out? My expectation is that the president is using this 90-day pause to give countries a chance to catch their breath, to give the US economy a chance to catch its breath, to allow the markets to stabilize, because we had this, vicious trifecta of losses in the stock market, convulsions in the bond markets, and then severe pressure on the dollar all at once. And I think the president responded to that, which is why the pause became, almost inevitable. But I think he wants at the end of this pause, essentially countries that are affected by the tariffs to come to him with a plan to essentially either increase US market access to their economies, or he wants relief from the tariffs that other countries have levied on US goods. So at the very least, I would say, his ambition is to negotiate a series of agreements with multiple countries to advance these specific objectives. And of course, remember what President Trump's bête noire is. The bête noire is US trade deficits. And the only way you can reduce those trade deficits in a hurry is if you can get other people to buy more US goods or give the United States some advantages with respect to access to those markets. And so I think he's going to push on both those buttons in the hope of getting these deals within 90 days.
But I mean, it's a huge lot of countries. And is it even possible to do so many deals within 90 days?
I'm skeptical about that. I'm
task.
skeptical about that because, the US Trade Representative's Office, which will be involved in sort of the in the weeds negotiations, is bureaucratically not capable of having simultaneous negotiations with 50, 60, 70 countries all at once. So, what I think this means is that you're not really going to get transformative trade agreements.
Mhm.
What you're essentially going to get is a piecemeal agreement to essentially either buy more American goods or give the United States greater access to those markets. And maybe if we are lucky, we can pull off something limited like that. But the advertising, which is that we are going to transform the entire global trading system, we are going to be able to create new kinds of trade agreements with, dozens and dozens of countries. I think that is just plain fiction. It's simply not going to happen within a 90-day period.
And the other thing that President Trump has done is to announce exemptions on consumer electronics like laptops and iPhones and so on. Do you think here he was actually responding to the American consumer? Is that also beginning to set in that this is going to hurt the American economy and the American consumer more than anybody else?
Well, without doubt, right? I mean, one of the necessary consequences of a tariff war, if the tariff war is to actually make sense, is that the tariffs have to be high, sufficiently high, and they have to be in place for an extended period of time if his objectives are to be realized. Now, the immediate consequence of that is essentially rising prices for the American consumer. And then the politics of rising prices is not exactly, favorable to presidential fortunes. We saw this during President Biden's term, where for a series of reasons, we had very significant price hikes at the consumer level in the United States. And people pinned that as essentially failures of the Biden presidency, that he was unable to manage essentially the economy in ways that helped, ordinary citizens. Now, this is going to be exactly the same problem that people are going to face because of Trump's tariffs. And so what he's tried to do is essentially create these carve-outs that would exempt at least some commodities that are very important to American citizens in their everyday life, right? So cell phones, electronics, possibly automobiles, in the hope of making this tariff agenda of his a little more palatable, to American citizens. Now, whether this will stay as a permanent carve-out is anyone's guess. But he's certainly responding to pressures that are coming from within, the political system in the United States.
You wrote in an article for Carnegie recently that what might emerge from the present disruption is that China will join the United States as a true great power. And despite China not matching up fully with the US, both nations will stand apart from the rest of the international system in terms of sheer capabilities for decades to come. Implicit in your analysis is that the US will survive Trump's onslaught and will still emerge as a true great power. But hasn't Trump destroyed America's preeminence already in just these 3 months that he has been in office?
So I think the Trump presidency, as we've seen it in the last few months, right, has been costly to the United States with respect to its reputation. But I think it will have only a marginal effect on American power because he is not going to be able to have the freedom to essentially pursue his agenda to the limits. Now, let's sort of unpack that for a moment, right? He has an objective of destroying the multilateral trading system. He wants to replace that entirely with bilateral trade agreements between the United States and all the countries of the world. I don't think that's going to happen. We can certainly make efforts, but I think the system is much more resilient. He wants to reshore manufacturing that has exited the United States over the last 30 or 40 years and bring it back to the United States. I don't think that's going to happen either because economics has a vote in these outcomes. And people exited the United States for a very simple reason, that American labor is costlier than the labor found in many other countries, and so on and so forth. So I think he's going to make the effort. That effort will have, of course, political effects, and it'll also have economic effects. But will it fundamentally derail the massive American economic machine? I doubt it. So we're going to deal with a lot of perturbations, but I don't think the fundamental trajectory of the United States is really going to be derailed. And remember, we are still the world's largest economy and the world's most important geopolitical center. Despite Trump's disturbances, I think that trajectory is pretty much baked in.
So it's not just about the economy, right? It's about everything that made America great, the universities, the soft power, everything, and its global presence, its global influence. And now you don't have even, there is doubt if there is something called the West. I mean, there's skepticism. There are question marks about whether there is something called the West as we traditionally understood that term, a Western alliance with the liberal democracies of Europe. That too, is in jeopardy. So what really remains of the West and what survives of the US?
I think this is a really important concern, right? I mean, what we have managed to do in this almost suicidal moment is break the natural links that we had with our partners around the world, especially our allies. And when we talked of the West, we talked about a strategic West, which tied the United States to the fortunes of Europe, which tied the United States to the fortunes of many important countries in the Far East, like Japan, like South Korea, and so on and so forth. I think those relationships are certainly in jeopardy. And it is entirely possible that by the end of this administration, those ties will have been damaged very significantly. I think that is a very realistic possibility, which raises two questions. Is the damage going to be permanent so that someone coming after Trump will simply be unable to rebuild those ties? That's question number one. And question number two is simply, what are the limits of that damage that Trump can impose? And I think these are still open questions, right? I mean, I'm not sure whether he is going to take some extreme positions with respect to the allies. He certainly made life hard for them, but whether he is willing to break all economic, all geopolitical ties, to me still remains to be answered. So there is still a residue of hope that I nurture, that we are going to go through difficult times. Our partners are going to lose their faith in the United States, but I'm still hopeful there will be some substratum that will survive Trump, which will allow us to rebuild, even though we will never go back to the same old world that we had before Trump took office for the second time.
And when you talk about China, we've seen this tit for tat tariff war between US and China, 125%, 145%, and now 245% likely on Chinese exports to the US. China is the only country that has said that it will not negotiate a deal with Trump on tariffs. So what cards is China holding here? Is it all about tariffs? Is it also non-tariffs? Might it be military?
Well, I think, the Chinese position was expected because they saw themselves as being in many ways the primary target of, Trump's trade war. But at the end of the day, the Chinese too will negotiate, right? They will negotiate because access to external markets is extremely important for the success of China's growth model. And at the end of the day, there is no alternative to China where the US market is concerned. That is, when you think of global demand and you think of three baskets of global demand, there's the United States, there's essentially the rest of the Western world outside the United States, and there's the global South. The global south is very important for symbolic reasons, for economic reasons over the long term, but it is not an alternative to the US market, not yet, because it's still composed of relatively poor countries which simply don't have purchasing power to sustain China's massive export machine. The same is true for the Western world outside of the United States. It's a very important market, and China will definitely make efforts to protect its access to those markets, especially in Western Europe, in East Asia, and so on and so forth. But it cannot, even today, serve as a perfect substitute for the US market, which at the end of the day means that unless China is going to move overnight to an alternative model of growth, which is emphasizing domestic consumption rather than investment, it is going to have to look to markets to absorb the products of its investment strategy. And the United States is front and center in terms of its importance for that success of that investment strategy. So I think over the long term, of course, China will want to shift to an alternative model of growth. But for the next 4 years, you cannot transform an investment-heavy growth strategy into a domestic consumption-driven growth strategy, even within a 4-year period, right? It takes a lot of time to do it. So I see the Chinese position right now, the determination not to engage in a discussion with the US, as more colored by political imperatives of not being seen as folding, not being seen as groveling before the United States. But I think under the surface, there are very practical considerations that are going to push Xi Jinping and the leadership to begin a serious negotiation. And my own view is that actually Trump wants that. He will want an agreement with China, the kind that he didn't get in his first term.
He's been signaling that he wants China to talk to him. That he's been reaching out, really, but he's been rebuffed.
Yes. And I think this is, again, part of the initial kabuki that, both sides are going to engage. Eventually, there will be a conversation. I don't know if there will be a deal, but there will certainly be a conversation because there are very strong incentives, both in Beijing and in Washington, to arrive at some sort of an agreement.
So when you say that these are the only two great powers that will emerge out of all this, how do you see this playing out? I mean, is it going to be like a Cold War kind of situation where, the US and the USSR arrived at a modus vivendi, and they have each had their own spheres of influence? So how do you see this panning out?
It is easier for me to talk about the material outcomes rather than the shape of the world, for the simple reason that we have greater confidence in what we can say about the trajectory of the two economies. I'll start with that, and then I'll attempt to answer the question about the political configuration. So I think we have confidence that the United States will maintain a steady growth rate over the next 10 to 20 years of between 2 and 3%. That has been historically the numbers that have defined the US economic trajectory.
Assuming that it comes out of this Trump slump.
Well, not really, because the United States does not depend on trade as much as many other economies. In fact, the trade to GDP ratios in the United States are actually much lower compared to many other great powers. So I expect that even with all these perturbations, the US will be able to maintain between 2% and 3% trend growth rates for a very long time. If that happens, the US will still be able to sustain its position as either the first or the second largest economy in the world. The real question is going to be China. There is a big difference if China's trend growth rate over the next 20 years is 2% or 4%. But irrespective of what number you pick, China is destined to remain the world's second largest economy, if not the world's first largest economy. So by sheer material sort of variables, the US and China are going to be there at the top. And the gap between the US and Chinese economies and the rest of the players in the field is going to be substantial, right? So now what does this mean for relations between the two? I think we'll really have to wait and see what the relationship is at the end of the Trump administration. Because right now we are sort of redefining that relationship between the two countries. My expectation is that we are going to have a frosty relationship in many ways because China has ambitions in East Asia that run counter to US interests. But we will not have a return to the Cold War for the simple reason that we will not be able to erase the realities of interdependence between our two countries. No matter what efforts Trump's make, he will make many efforts in the next 4 years. I do not see him able to simply eject China from its center of global manufacturing. I do not see him able to transfer all the manufacturing capabilities that China currently has back to the United States. Now, if that is taken for granted, then the United States and China are going to have very deep umbilical links. We will sort of try and trim those on the margins. But the basic interdependence between these two countries, I think, is going to persist, even if we reduce the volumes of trade bilaterally and so on and so forth, which means that we are not going to be in the same position that we were with the Soviet Union. We are going to have a relationship that is marked equally by conflict as well as various forms of tacit cooperation. And I think that is going to be the character of, the global order going forward.
Meanwhile, we have seen that President Xi Jinping is on a tour of Southeast Asia. He's gone to Vietnam, he's gone to Malaysia, and he said that Chinese markets are open to their goods. So is there a possibility that the countries of that region will now shift their focus to trading with China? I mean, to trying to access Chinese markets, which were not that open to them before, but he's inviting them.
Well, that is going to be interesting, right? Because what he is doing, as many other countries will as well, is they're going to be looking to diversify their trade relationships because of the perturbations caused by Trump's policies. And he is now looking very seriously at Pacific Asia and telling them that China is going to be much more receptive to the flow of their goods and services in a way that it has not historically been. And he is doing this for economic and political reasons. For economic reasons, because he needs to alter the imbalances in China's relationship with Pacific Asia, the imbalances that favor China today. He needs to give them some sort of economic palliatives to rely on China. And so there is a completely sensible economic logic to his strategy. But politically, it's just as important, right? He does not want to lose Chinese influence in that part of the world because that is so important for China's interests. And so this is where there is a convergence between China's economic interests and its geopolitical interests. He needs to keep Pacific Asia in China's corner rather than keeping Pacific Asia in America's corner. Now, unfortunately, the United States is doing a very fine job of alienating, our partners in Pacific Asia, which makes, Xi Jinping's overtures far more attractive than they would have otherwise been. But even so, I would say the jury is still out in terms of how this pans out.
China at this point is kind of offering more certainty on trade than the US. And this is also true for Europe. I think even Europe is considering China more seriously now than it was doing before, isn't it?
So I would say that the Chinese are saying the right things. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether they will follow up by doing the right things. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese economy is still a quite controlled economy. And the problems that China's growth has created for the global trading system are not problems that are going to disappear in a hurry, right? So the question we have to ask is, not what Xi Jinping says, but what will Xi Jinping actually do? Simple questions. Will he give market access to China's markets to its trading partners, whether it be in Europe or whether it be in the Indo-Pacific? Is he willing to remove the restrictions with respect to the forcible transfer of intellectual property, which has been a model that China has exploited for 30 or 40 years? These are hard decisions that Xi Jinping will have to make, right? Because it's changing the Chinese model from what has been in place now for many decades to something entirely new. I will wait to see whether he makes that happen. Now, if he were to do that, then I think his ability to attract partners that we are losing will increase. But if all that he is doing is essentially making the right noises in the face of the alienation that the United States has engineered, then I don't think it will be persuasive enough because, talk is cheap.
So I'm going to move to India now. You have written in that same article that that India's hope that it can get something for itself out of all this disruption, that the silver linings that it is seeing may be misplaced. India does believe that it can arrive at a trade agreement with the Trump administration over the next 3 months, that it will be, which will help it to sidestep the tariffs. India also seems to believe that 26% tariff is better than, say, 46% on Vietnam or the 44% on Sri Lanka and so on. Why do you think that this hope is misplaced? Why do you think that India shouldn't be so sanguine?
Well, because I think India will do well in purely bilateral terms. Assuming that there is enough discipline on both sides, enough goodwill on both sides, I think India and the United States will be able to reach an agreement that resolves the immediate problem at the moment, which is getting rid of these tariffs that Trump has imposed. But remember, there are two other effects that neither the United States nor India can fix in a hurry, right? One is sort of the general equilibrium effects, which is we may resolve the problems with India, but if we don't resolve problems with other countries, which India relies on for either primary or intermediate inputs, there will still be costs to the Indian economy. So even if there is a peace pact between Delhi and Washington, but there is no peace pact, for example, between, say, Washington and Beijing, then India's reliance on Chinese products, which has been true for many, many years now, India will have to bear the brunt of higher cost Chinese products and so on and so forth. So there will be consequences for India that arise simply because of the larger disturbances in the trade system that go beyond the United States and India specifically. The second is, we don't know what kind of a world we are going to leave behind geopolitically. I mean, the presumption for the last 70, 80 years has been that the US will be the fundamental balancer in the global system, right? It will preserve an Asia that is whole, united, and free. What if the United States, as part of this great disruption, decides that it does not want to carry the burdens of preserving a favorable balance of power in Asia that actually protects India's interests? Now, that is going to be a huge cost. If the United States decides that China is not worth containing because we can somehow reach a bilateral deal, or if the costs of protecting Japan, South Korea, the Indian Ocean, and so on and so forth is prohibitive, and so the US either neglects that responsibility or simply subcontracts it to others, you're going to have a very different geopolitical environment. And so when, I see my Indian friends sometimes very casually saying that, oh, this destruction of the global order creates new opportunities for us, I'm tempted to say yes and no. It'll create some opportunities. It'll create some space for India to maneuver. But it'll also create real constraints because think about it. If we do not make the investments to balance China, if we do not continue to make the investments with respect to the provision of global public goods, with respect to freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, maintaining and upholding all the international institutions that we have created, right? Is that world actually a world that favors India's interests? I don't think so. And so I think one needs to look at the longer term consequences of this disruption a little more closely before anyone in New Delhi sort of declares victory, at least for Indian interests, as a result of Trump's policies.
Do you think India would have been in a better place had it taken the initiative to uh, stand up as the voice of the global South on this whole tariffs, on the tariff war by Trump? I mean, to articulate that this is not doing the developing world any good, that many countries will go under, sorry. And instead, we've seen China take that position. It may be self-destructive, it may be foolhardy of China to have done that, but it did send out a message to the world that China speaks up, and China speaks seemingly for the developing world. But India is seeing silver linings for itself in this disruption. Do you think India should have actually stood up and said, no, this is not on?
It's hard for me to sort of make a judgment about what is in India's best interest, right? Because that's a function of the preferences of the government of the day. But if we were to think of this as cold-blooded realists, mm-hmm. I think the call India made was probably the right one for itself. Only because it judged that the benefits to itself far outweighed the benefits that it would have incurred if it became a champion of the global South. I think the view in Delhi, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but the view in Delhi, I think, or at least in the government, was, yes, it would be nice to be a champion of the global South. But if India took a very bold position, it would only alienate the United States. It would make getting a bilateral deal with Trump even harder. And at the end of the day, it would put real Indian interests at risk. And so I think this government essentially took the call that they were going to protect their equities, their national equities, which are obviously far more valuable to India than protecting some collective good, which is essentially what arguing for the global South entails. So let the Chinese do it. They're a far more powerful country. The dependence and the leverage they have vis-a-vis the United States is much greater. And so I think the Indians made the call that this is a fight that is best left, to Chinese leadership rather than Indian leadership at this point in time.
But as you said, the bilateral relationship is ticking along. There was a visit by Prime Minister Modi, an early visit to Washington, and his meeting with Trump. And, for all apparent purposes, it went off well. They signed an agreement to have a 10-year framework on defense. They have signed an agreement on technology. They have they agreed to hammer out a trade agreement, and also the civil nuclear agreement with which you were closely involved. That also has made some progress, and now you have the first. You have a US company going to make the build and design a reactor in India. It's got permission from the US Department of Energy. So how do you see this bilateral relationship progressing? What are the next developments going to be on this front?
So I'm very optimistic about the bilateral relationship progressing well. And the reason for that is that the government of India is deeply invested in the relationship, and it will push. The uncertainty I have is about our policy consistency and our capacity to deliver on the promises we've made. Because if we had the right people in place, because all the previous history of success in US-India relations has really been a function of people, the right people in the right places taking responsibility for moving the relationship forward. And that goes back to George W. Bush all the way to President Biden. I'm not sure just now that that magic ingredient is in place on the US side. So broadly speaking, yes, the policy processes will take us in the right direction. But whether we can sustain the pace of breakthroughs is still an open question mark in my mind, simply because we do not have the bureaucratic ducks lined up in a row on the US side. I do not see the presence of champions within the US government to invest in this relationship in India just yet. Now, there may be people like, the president himself, because he professes a great affection for India and a great affection for Prime Minister Modi. But he's not always the most consistent or the most attentive person, right? And he has much bigger fish to fry in terms of his larger domestic and international agendas. So the spirit may be willing, but if the flesh is not in the best shape possible, we may still falter. So broadly speaking, yes, I'm optimistic about the direction of the relationship, but to be able to actually put wins on the ground, I think will require a few more pieces that I don't see are in place just yet.
So one last question I have for you. Do you have a prediction for a post-Trump era? Can everyone just turn the clock back to what it was on January 20th, 2025, 4 years from now, and go back to the world as it was before Trump took charge of the United States?
I am afraid that's not feasible. Because even if the United States comes to its senses and decides to go back to upholding the world that it had previously built, let's assume we get a liberal internationalist who actually has political heft at home, right? And is willing to engage in a serious effort at restoration. The problem is we have done incredible damage to global confidence in the United States. And we will take a long time in order to overcome the inhibitions that exist now because of that loss of confidence. I'm not saying it's not impossible to do, but it would require a liberal internationalist in the presidency, not for one term, but for many terms in succession, for people to say, okay, we believe the United States when it says that it wants to preserve a liberal order that benefits all of us. I think right now, after Trump's second term in office, the system will have been shaken so drastically to its foundations that people are going to have a hard time believing the United States. And there is a simple reality that no one can overlook, right? Today, the United States is a deeply polarized society. There are about 40% of the American electorate which simply are very comfortable with Trump's policies and will champion his current policies no matter what, even after he leaves the scene. People are going to look at that and say, okay, even if we are lucky enough to have a liberal internationalist president, as long as there is a divided American polity, a substantial portion of American citizens who are simply not convinced about the value of the world for the United States, how much can we afford to believe the promises of a future American president with respect to restoration? How robust are those promises going to be? So in order to be able to do genuine restoration, we're going to need changes, of course, at the apex level. You're going to need a new president with a new vision and so on and so forth. But equally, you are going to need a transformation of American politics at the ground level. And to my mind, that transformation is going to be much harder to engineer than simply a change of presidency. We saw this in the case of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden was your great internationalist president. This was supposed to be the moment of restoration where we put all the ghosts of Trump's first term to bed forever. But what was the reality? The reality was Joe Biden was hemmed in by Trump's legacies in many important ways, including with respect to trade and industrial policy. Let's not forget. He continued Trump's trade and industrial policies in ways that people, find sometimes hard to accept. Now, that is a reflection of the fact that there is still a large percentage of voters who are very comfortable with an insular and isolated United States. And my fear is, as long as people from the outside see that, they're going to be a little more cautious about believing American promises of restoration. Even if those promises are sort of, well-intentioned and are serious. So, Nirupama, I'm really sorry that there's no obvious good news here. We will have to deal with a new world wherein the United States simply cannot be overlooked. But it will not be a world where the United States simply can go back to, however attractive that vision is.
Thank you for your time, Ashley Tellis. I appreciate all the time that you've given me. And thank you very much.